Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to take you back to a time when life was far harsher, simpler, and yet remarkably enduring. Imagine yourself not as a knight in shining armor or a lord in his hall, but as a humble medieval peasant, one among the countless ordinary men, women, and children who made up the backbone of society. Now imagine that it is winter. Not the mild winters we know today in many places, but a winter that could stretch on for months with biting cold, snow piled high, and little light to ease the burden of endless nights. The medieval peasant's survival in such brutal seasons was not simply a matter of comfort, it was a matter of life and death. To understand how they endured, we must wander through their villages, their fields, their huts, their food stores, and even their faith, for all of these were tools they used to withstand the long cold months. The first thing to imagine is their homes. A peasant's dwelling was often a small, one-room hut made of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof, drafty walls, and a floor that was sometimes little more than packed earth. Inside, a central hearth provided the only real source of heat. There was no chimney, so smoke from the fire filled the room, blackening the beams and clinging to clothing and skin. Yet, this smoke, unpleasant as it was, also had a hidden benefit: it helped preserve the thatch from insects and pests. On winter nights, the fire was kept low to conserve fuel, and the entire family, sometimes including the livestock, would gather close to the warmth. Cows, goats, or chickens might be brought indoors, not out of affection, but because their body heat added to the warmth of the household and their survival meant milk, eggs, and future food supplies. Imagine the cramped quarters, the smell of smoke, damp straw, animals, and unwashed bodies, but also the sense of closeness, of shared hardship, that made survival possible. Food was the second and perhaps most critical challenge. In the autumn months, peasants harvested what they could and stored it in preparation for the cold season. Grain was the staple of their diet, ground into coarse bread that was often dark, heavy, and sometimes mixed with other ingredients like beans, peas, or even tree bark in times of shortage. To last through winter, peasants salted, smoked, or dried whatever meat they could spare, though most households could rarely afford to slaughter animals except for special occasions. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and cabbages were stored in cool cellars or buried in the ground to keep them edible through frost. Beans and lentils were dried, cheeses were hardened, and ale was brewed in advance, since water sources could freeze or be unsafe to drink. Hunger was an ever-present companion, and the harshest winters could bring famine if stores ran low or harvests had been poor. Many winters were remembered not by their beauty but by their cruelty, by the deaths of neighbors from starvation or by the thinness of children's faces as food supplies dwindled. Clothing was another matter of survival. Peasants did not have wardrobes full of garments. Instead, they layered what they owned, often coarse wool garments spun and woven locally. Linen shirts were worn under tunics, cloaks were clasped tightly, and woolen hoods covered the head. Mittens, if available, were simple, sometimes shared, and boots were often made from leather or rough cloth stuffed with straw for insulation. These garments were not fashionable or soft, but they were sturdy and practical, designed to keep out wind and trap what warmth the body could generate. Sheep were a peasant's ally, not only for food but for their wool, which was spun into yarn by women of the household and turned into clothing. Repairs were constant, as new clothing was expensive and rare. A tear or a hole was quickly patched, and garments were passed down through generations, worn until they could no longer be salvaged. Daily work, though grueling, did not stop in winter. The rhythm of the agricultural year slowed, for fields lay fallow or snowbound, but there was still much to do. Men mended tools, sharpened plows, and prepared equipment for spring. Women spun thread, wove cloth, baked bread, and cared for animals. Children gathered firewood or fetched water from icy streams. Every small task contributed to survival. Even leisure was practical. Stories told by the fire, songs sung in the evenings, all served to pass the time, strengthen bonds, and preserve oral traditions. Winter was a season of patience, of enduring monotony, of waiting for the earth to awaken again. Fuel was another constant concern. Wood had to be collected before winter, for cutting green wood was difficult and it burned poorly. Peasants relied on what they could gather from the Lord's land, though access was often restricted. Dung was dried and used as fuel, an unpleasant but necessary resource. Peat, cut from bogs, was another alternative. The fire was carefully tended, sometimes banked under ashes to smolder overnight, so that in the morning it could be coaxed back to life without wasting scarce tinder. To let the fire die in the heart of winter could mean bitter cold and even death. Illness was another enemy in the long winters. With poor nutrition, crowded quarters, and little fresh air or sunlight, peasants were vulnerable to disease. Colds, fevers, and respiratory illnesses spread quickly in the smoke-filled huts. Medicine, as we know it, was primitive, relying on herbs, charms, and the wisdom of local healers. Prayer was as important as any treatment, for in the medieval mind, survival was not only physical but spiritual. The church played a crucial role in peasant life, offering rituals, festivals, and a framework for understanding suffering. Winter feasts, especially Christmas and later Candlemas, were times when communities gathered, shared what little they had, and renewed hope. Even in hardship, faith gave meaning, and the cycle of the liturgical year reminded peasants that spring would return, as surely as Christ would rise. Community itself was a form of survival. No peasant lived in isolation, villages functioned as networks of support. Families helped one another, sharing food when possible, repairing homes, or assisting with births and deaths. During the harshest storms, survival depended not just on one's own household but on the strength of neighbors. Stories of collective resilience are numerous, for in those long months, companionship was as necessary as bread or firewood. The bonds forged in winter hardships shaped the very fabric of medieval rural life. Let us not romanticize their endurance too much, however. Winter was a time of suffering, and for many, it was a season of loss. Records tell of years when entire villages starved, when children were abandoned because families could not feed them, when disease claimed lives in numbers that left fields untended and homes abandoned. To be a peasant in medieval winter was to live always on the edge, balancing between survival and disaster. Yet, what is remarkable is not merely that so many suffered, but that so many endured. Year after year, generation after generation, they found ways to persist, using every resource, every skill, and every bond they had. As you listen, perhaps with drowsy eyes, you might picture the quiet of a medieval village under snow. A thin line of smoke rising from low thatched roofs, a cluster of huts huddled against the wind, the muffled sound of animals within. Inside, around the dim glow of the hearth, a family sits close together, wrapped in rough wool, sharing bread that tastes of grain and smoke, sipping weak ale, whispering prayers, and telling tales to keep the children calm. Outside, the world is frozen, but inside, human warmth, fragile though it is, holds back the dark. This was survival, not heroic, not glorious, but stubborn, steady, and deeply human. And so, when we reflect on how medieval peasants survived brutal winters, we see that their endurance was not the product of grand inventions or luxurious comforts, but of resilience born from necessity. Their homes, however drafty, sheltered them. Their food, however coarse, nourished them. Their clothing, however rough, protected them. Their faith, however simple, sustained them. And above all, their sense of community, of family and neighbor, made survival possible. They remind us that history is not only the tale of kings and battles, but of ordinary people who faced extraordinary challenges and endured. As the fire of their hearts burned low through the long nights, so too did their hope burn, carrying them through to the promise of spring.